The wedding was nothing less than a dream. The grand hall was decorated with shining lights, beautiful flowers, and golden chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Guests arrived in their best clothes, their laughter and chatter filling the air with joy. The bride looked stunning in her white gown, and the groom stood tall in his elegant suit, his eyes filled with love and excitement. Music played softly in the background as waiters moved gracefully, serving delicious food and drinks to the guests. Everyone was in a festive mood, celebrating love and happiness. The families of the bride and groom were busy greeting guests, making sure everyone felt welcome. The photographers captured every special moment, the laughter, the happy tears, and the little children running around in excitement. In the middle of this beautiful celebration, something unexpected happened. A man stood at the entrance of the hall. He was not dressed in a fine suit, nor did he carry a gift like the other guests. His clothes were old and worn out, and his hair was messy. He had a tired look on his face, as if life had been very hard for him. At first, nobody noticed him. Everyone was too busy enjoying the wedding. But as he stepped forward, a few guests turned to look at him. Some raised their eyebrows, wondering who he was. Others whispered among themselves, curious about why he had come. The security guards near the entrance also noticed him. One of them took a step forward, ready to stop him. But before they could do anything, the man slowly walked further into the hall. His eyes moved across the room, looking at the guests, the decorations, and the happy couple standing near the stage. Some people frowned, uncomfortable with his presence. They wondered why someone like him would walk into such a grand wedding. A few guests even moved aside, as if they did not want to be near him. But the man didn't seem to care about the whispers or the glances. He was looking for someone. His eyes kept moving until they finally stopped on the groom. The moment he saw him, something changed in his expression. It was a look of deep emotion, something between pride and sadness. The groom, unaware of the man's presence, was laughing with his friends, enjoying his big day. But soon, he felt the weight of a stare and turned in the direction of the entrance. The moment his eyes met the man's, his smile faded. For a second, it was as if time had stopped. The groom's face showed confusion, then surprise, and then something even deeper, something unspoken. The guests, who had been ignoring the man, now grew even more curious. Who was this person? Why was the groom looking at him with such an expression? The room, once filled with laughter and music, now had a strange silence. Something was about to happen, something no one had expected. But before anyone could say anything, the man took another step forward. Then, in a clear, steady voice, he asked for the microphone. The music slowly faded as the man stood there, his presence now impossible to ignore. People exchanged glances, their expressions filled with confusion and curiosity. Some whispered among themselves, trying to guess who he was. Others simply stared, waiting to see what would happen next. The bride, standing beside the groom, noticed the sudden change in his expression. Just a moment ago, he had been laughing, his face glowing with happiness. But now he looked different. His smile had disappeared, replaced by something she couldn't quite understand. She gently touched his arm, but he didn't react. His eyes were fixed on the man at the entrance. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. They had never seen this man before, and he certainly didn't look like he belonged at such a grand event. His clothes were old, his shoes worn out, and his face had lines that spoke of hardships. Some guests quietly asked each other if they should call security. The groom's parents, standing nearby, also noticed the stranger. His mother frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. His father's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the man. Meanwhile, the man took a slow step forward. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't afraid. He simply looked around the room, his gaze calm yet filled with something deep, something personal. The guests felt the weight of his presence, though they didn't understand why. One of the security guards finally stepped forward, ready to stop him. "Sir, do you have an invitation?" The guard asked politely, though his tone carried a warning. The man didn't answer right away. He looked past the guard, his focus still on the groom. Then, as if sensing that everyone was waiting for a response, he finally spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. "I just need a moment," he said. "Just a moment to speak." A ripple of murmurs spread across the hall. "Speak? About what? And to whom?" The wedding planner hurried over, clearly concerned. "Sir, this is a private event," she said, trying to keep her voice gentle but firm. "If you need something, I can help you outside." Still, the man did not move. He turned his head slightly, looking at the groom once again. His gaze was not demanding, not forceful. It was simply knowing, as if he recognized the groom from somewhere. The groom, still silent, swallowed hard. Something in his eyes shifted. He knew this man. He was sure of it. But from where? How? The guests, now fully invested in the unexpected scene, continued to watch with curiosity and impatience. Some whispered that this was an uncomfortable interruption, an embarrassment at such a beautiful wedding. Others felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something important was about to unfold. The bride, still holding the groom's arm, finally spoke in a soft voice. "Do you know him?" she asked. The groom didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Then, to everyone's surprise, he gave a small nod. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I do." A hush fell over the crowd. The man took another step forward and, in a steady voice, repeated his request. "Please," he said, "just a moment. Let me speak." The groom hesitated for only a second before turning to the DJ. Without breaking eye contact with the man, he gave a small nod. "Give him the mic," he said. A wave of shock swept through the guests. The whispers grew louder. The security guard looked uncertain. But when the groom had spoken, there was no more arguing. The DJ, looking hesitant, slowly handed over the microphone. The room, once filled with music and laughter, now held a deep, suspenseful silence. Everyone waited. And then the man began to speak. The man held the microphone in his rough, calloused hands. His fingers trembled slightly, but his eyes remained steady. The entire hall was silent now. The once lively chatter had disappeared, replaced by a thick air of curiosity and tension. The guests, who had been laughing and enjoying the wedding moments ago, now sat frozen in their seats, their eyes fixed on the stranger standing in the middle of the grand hall. The groom stood still, his hands clenched at his sides. His heart pounded as he stared at the man. He knew him. He was certain of it, but his mind was struggling to place exactly where and when they had met. The memories felt distant, like a dream he couldn't quite grasp. The bride, sensing the weight of the moment, gently held his arm. She didn't speak, but her touch was comforting, silently telling him that she was there, that whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. The man took a deep breath, bringing the microphone close to his lips. His voice, though rough and weathered, carried a strange sense of warmth. "I know many of you are wondering why I'm here," he said, looking around the room. "I know I don't belong in a place like this. I wasn't invited. I don't have fine clothes or expensive gifts to offer. But I came here today because I had to." A few guests exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Some were still skeptical, while others leaned in, genuinely curious about what he had to say. The man's eyes turned back to the groom. "You may not remember me," he continued, "but I remember you." The groom's breath hitched. Something about those words sent a shiver down his spine. His eyes searched the man's face, looking for a sign, a clue, anything that could unlock the memory trapped inside him. The man smiled slightly, though there was sadness in it. "You were just a boy back then," he said. "A boy who had nothing. A boy who was lost. A boy who needed someone." A gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. The groom's eyes widened as a flood of emotions rushed through him. He knew now. He remembered. Years ago, before the success, Before the wealth, before the life he had built, there had been a time when he had no one. A time when he was just a struggling child, surviving each day with nothing but hope. And in those dark days, there had been one man who had helped him. A man who had given him guidance, support, and kindness when no one else had. The man standing before him. The groom's throat felt tight. "It's you," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. The man gave a small nod. "Yes," he said, "it's me." The guests, now completely drawn into the moment, looked between the two men, trying to understand the depth of their connection. The whispers had stopped. The judgment had faded. Now, there was only silence and anticipation. The groom felt his chest tighten with emotion. He had thought this man was gone, lost in the past. He had never imagined he would see him again, especially not on his wedding day. The man continued, his voice filled with sincerity. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," he said. "I didn't come to interrupt your happiness. I came because I wanted to see you one last time. I wanted to see the man you've become." Tears welled up in the groom's eyes. He had spent years building a new life, moving forward and chasing success. But in all that time, he had forgotten to look back. He had forgotten the one person who had once been his guiding light. The man took a small step back and smiled. "And now that I have," he said softly, "I can leave in peace." He turned, as if ready to walk away. But before he could take another step, the groom did something no one expected. He reached forward, grabbing the man's hand, holding him back. And with a voice filled with emotion, he spoke just 2 words. The hall remained completely silent. Every eye was fixed on the groom and the man he had just stopped from leaving. The guests, who had once judged the stranger's presence, now sat frozen, caught in the unexpected emotion of the moment. The groom's grip on the man's hand was firm, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Don't go," he repeated, his voice slightly trembling. He couldn't let this man just walk away, not after everything. The man turned back, surprised. His tired eyes softened as he looked at the groom. "You don't have to do this," he said gently. "This is your special day. I didn't mean to cause a scene." But the groom shook his head. "You didn't cause a scene," he replied. "You reminded me of something I should have never forgotten." The bride, standing beside him, watched quietly, sensing the deep connection between them. She had never seen this side of her husband before. The way he looked at this man, it was not just recognition. It was gratitude, pain, and something even deeper. The groom took a deep breath and turned toward the crowd. "Many of you don't know this," he said, addressing the guests, "but there was a time in my life when I had nothing. No family, no home, no hope." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some guests who had only known him as a successful man looked at him in surprise. Others listened intently, waiting to hear more. The groom glanced at the man beside him before continuing. "I was just a boy when life became difficult for me. I had nowhere to go, no one to guide me. And then I met him." He looked at the man, his voice filled with emotion. "He was the only person who helped me, the only one who saw me as more than just a lost kid. He gave me food when I was hungry, wisdom when I was confused, and kindness when I felt invisible." The guests were completely drawn in now, their earlier judgments forgotten. They looked at the man in a new light, realizing he was not just a stranger. He was part of the groom's story. The groom swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. But then, one day, he disappeared. I never knew what happened to him. I searched for him, but he was gone. And as life moved on, I got busy chasing success, building a future, and I forgot to look back. The man gave a small smile. "That was the point," he said softly. "I wanted you to move forward. I wanted you to succeed." The groom shook his head. "But I should have remembered you. I should have never let the man who saved me become just a memory." Tears glistened in the man's eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. "You don't owe me anything," he said. The groom tightened his grip on the man's hand. "That's where you're wrong," he said firmly. "I owe you everything." The bride wiped a tear from her eye, overwhelmed by the moment. She had always known her husband was a good man, but today she saw the depth of his heart in a way she never had before. The guests, many of whom had first judged the man's appearance, now felt something shift within them. They saw beyond his clothes, beyond his tired face. They saw a man who had once been a hero to a lost child. A soft applause started from the back of the room. Then another, and another, until the entire hall was clapping, not out of politeness, but out of respect. The groom turned back to the man. "You're not leaving," he said with a small smile. "Not like this." The man looked at him, confused. "Then how?" he asked. The groom grinned, and in front of everyone, he pulled the man into a tight embrace. "You're staying," he whispered. "Your family." The hall remained silent for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then the sound of applause grew louder, filling the room with warmth and admiration. Some guests wiped away tears, while others nodded in respect. No one had expected such an emotional turn of events at a wedding, but now they felt honored to witness something so real, so powerful. The man, still caught in the groom's tight embrace, stood frozen for a moment. His eyes shimmered with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had spent so much time believing he was forgotten, that his presence in the groom's life no longer mattered. And yet, here he was, being held like family, being welcomed with love. The groom finally pulled back, placing both hands on the man's shoulders. "You're not leaving," he said again, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as someone who belongs here." The man's lips quivered, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, his heart too full to speak. The bride, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Welcome," she said softly, her eyes kind. "Today is not just about our love story. It's about the people who shaped us, the ones who made us who we are. And you are a part of that story." The man looked at her, touched by her words. She didn't know him, yet she accepted him without question. He could see why the groom loved her. The wedding planner, who had earlier been worried about the unexpected situation, now smiled and signaled the staff. Almost instantly, a chair was brought forward and placed at the head table, right beside the groom's parents. The groom gently took the man's hand and led him towards it. Some guests, still in awe, whispered among themselves. "Who would have thought?" One man murmured. "At first, I thought he was just some random wedding crasher." "We all did," another guest admitted, shaking his head. "But now, I see something else." The man hesitated for a second before sitting down, as if still unsure whether he truly belonged there. But as soon as he did, the groom's mother placed a gentle hand on his, offering him a smile of understanding. The groom's father, usually a man of few words, gave a small nod of approval. The meal continued, but now there was a different energy in the room. Guests no longer saw the man as an outsider. Instead, they saw him as someone who carried a piece of the groom's past, someone who had played a role in shaping his journey. As the evening progressed, the music started again, and people returned to the dance floor. Laughter and joy filled the hall, but the man remained seated for a while, watching everything with a sense of disbelief. He had spent years thinking he was alone in the world. Yet tonight, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. The groom eventually returned to his side, sitting down beside him. "So," he said with a smile, "are you ready to tell me where you disappeared all those years ago?" The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's a long story," he said. "Not all of it is good." The groom nodded. "That's okay. I have time." The man looked at him for a moment before nodding back. For the first time in years, he felt like someone was truly listening. The groom leaned forward slightly, his eyes filled with curiosity and concern. The wedding celebrations continued around them, guests laughing, music playing, and people dancing. But for him, at that moment, nothing else mattered. He wanted to know the truth. He needed to understand why the man who had once been his savior had vanished all those years ago. The man let out a small sigh, his rough hands resting on the table. He looked down for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, then lifted his eyes to meet the groom's. Life, it doesn't always go as planned, he started, his voice calm but filled with emotions. The groom nodded, waiting patiently. The man continued, his gaze drifting into the past. After I helped you, I had my own struggles. I was already living a simple life back then, but I didn't mind. I found joy in helping others, in doing what I could for people like you, those who needed a little kindness. A small, nostalgic smile appeared on his face, but it faded quickly. But one day, things changed. I lost my job. It wasn't much, but it kept me going. Without it, everything became difficult. I tried to find new work, but nothing lasted. Before I knew it, I had nothing left. The groom felt a pang in his chest. He had been so busy building his own life that he had never thought about what might have happened to the man who had once saved him. I didn't want anyone to know, the man continued, especially not you. You were just a kid back then, trying to survive. I didn't want to add to your troubles. He looked at the groom with sad but proud eyes. So I left. I moved from place to place, hoping to find work, hoping to rebuild. But life isn't always kind. The groom clenched his fists. You should have come to me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Even if I was just a kid, I would have found a way to help you. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. And that's exactly why I didn't. You had a future ahead of you. I didn't want you to waste your time worrying about me. I knew, deep down, that you would make something of yourself. And look at you now. He gestured around the beautifully decorated hall. You built a life. You found love. That's all I ever wanted for you. The groom felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes. He had spent so many years thinking that the man had simply disappeared, never realizing that he had been struggling, suffering in silence. But what about now? The groom asked softly. Where have you been all these years? The man hesitated before answering. I've been living on the streets, finding shelter where I can. Some days are harder than others, but I've learned to survive. He gave a small, tired smile. I wasn't planning to come here today. I didn't even know if I would be welcome. But when I heard your name, I had to see you, even if just from a distance. I wanted to know if you were happy. The groom couldn't hold back his emotions anymore. He reached forward and took the man's hands in his own. You don't have to live like that anymore, he said firmly. Not now. Not ever again. The man looked at him with wide eyes. What do you mean? I mean you're coming home with me. The groom said without hesitation. I won't let you disappear again. You saved me once. Now it's my turn to do the same for you. Tears welled up in the man's eyes. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He had spent so long believing he was alone, that no one cared. But here was the boy he had once helped, now a grown man, offering him something he had never expected. Family. The groom gave him a reassuring smile. This isn't charity, he said gently. This is love. You are a part of my story, and I won't let you struggle anymore. The man blinked rapidly, trying to hold back his emotions. For the first time in years, he felt something he had long forgotten. The man sat still, staring at the groom in disbelief. His heart pounded in his chest. Could this really be happening? Was someone truly offering him a home, a second chance at life? For years, he had been invisible to the world, just another forgotten soul wandering the streets. But now, here he was, being told that he mattered. The groom squeezed his hands gently. I mean it, he said. You're not going back to the streets. From now on, you have a place with me. You have a family. Tears welled up in the man's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. trying to keep his emotions in check. I don't know what to say, he whispered. I never thought. He paused, struggling to find the right words. I never thought anyone would care. The groom's expression softened. You cared for me when no one else did, he said. Now it's my turn. The bride, who had been quietly watching, stepped closer, her eyes warm with kindness. You don't have to feel alone anymore, she said softly. From today, you're a part of our lives. The man looked between them, his hands trembling slightly. He had spent years believing that he was just a shadow, that he was nothing more than a forgotten past. But here they were, treating him like family, like he truly belonged. A few guests had gathered nearby, listening to their conversation. One of them, an older woman, wiped away a tear and turned to her husband. We judged too quickly, she whispered. We thought he was just a stranger, but he's part of something beautiful. Her husband nodded, his eyes filled with respect. This is what true kindness looks like, he said. This is what real love means. The man took a deep breath, his emotions overwhelming him. But what will people say? He asked hesitantly. I don't belong in a place like this. I have nothing to offer. The groom shook his head. You gave me everything when I had nothing, he replied. You didn't ask for anything in return. Now, I'm doing the same. You don't need to offer anything. Just stay. The man's lips quivered. He had spent so long surviving, always thinking about the next meal, the next shelter, the next cold night. He had never dared to dream of a future beyond that. But now, the groom was offering him something he hadn't felt in years: security, love, and a place where he wouldn't have to fight alone. The bride gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Tonight, you stay here with us, she said. Tomorrow, we'll figure everything out. But for now, just know you are safe. The man swallowed hard, overwhelmed by their kindness. He had come to the wedding just to catch a glimpse of the boy he once helped. He had never expected this. The groom smiled and gestured toward the table. Come on, he said. You didn't eat, did you? The man hesitated for a moment, but then, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe. He allowed himself to accept kindness without questioning it. With a small nod, he sat down at the table, and the bride personally served him a plate of food. He stared at it for a moment before picking up the fork. The first bite brought warmth to his heart, not just because of the food, but because of what it represented: acceptance, belonging, and a new beginning. Around him, the guests started to see the beauty of the moment. Some of them approached, offering small smiles, nods of respect, and even words of encouragement. The man, who had once been ignored, was now surrounded by kindness. As the evening continued, he listened to the laughter, the music, the sounds of happiness. For the first time in years, he wasn't watching from the outside. He was inside, a part of it. And for the first time in a long, long time, he allowed himself to feel something he had lost long ago. As the night went on, the wedding celebration continued, but for the man, everything felt like a dream. He had spent years being invisible, unnoticed, and forgotten. And now, here he was, surrounded by warmth, kindness, and people who cared. It was something he had never expected. The groom and bride stayed close to him, making sure he felt included. Every now and then, the groom would place a comforting hand on his shoulder, as if reminding him that he was not alone. The bride would smile at him, making sure he had everything he needed. Their small gestures meant more to him than they could ever know. Some guests who had once judged him from afar now approached with kind words. A middle-aged man patted his back and said, I respect you. You helped a child once, and today that kindness has come back to you. An elderly woman smiled warmly and said, You are not just a guest here. You are family now. The man's heart swelled with emotions he couldn't even name. He had spent so long thinking he didn't matter. But tonight, he realized that his actions had never been forgotten. The kindness he had given long ago had found its way back to him. As the final dance of the evening began, The groom turned to him with a playful smile. "Come on," he said. "Let's dance." The man let out a surprised laugh and shook his head. "I haven't danced in years," he admitted. The groom chuckled. "Neither have I. But it doesn't matter. This is a night of celebration." With gentle encouragement, the groom led him to the dance floor. The music played softly, and though at first the man felt shy, he soon found himself swaying to the rhythm, laughing at the joy of the moment. The bride joined them, as did some of the guests, and for the first time in years, the man didn't feel like an outsider. He was part of something beautiful. As the wedding came to an end, the guests began saying their goodbyes. Some of them shook the man's hand, offering kind words and warm smiles. The groom and bride stood beside him the whole time, making sure he never felt alone. When it was finally time to leave, the groom turned to him and said, "Come on, let's go home." The man hesitated. The word home felt unfamiliar to him now. It had been so long since he had a place to call his own. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "I don't want to be a burden." The groom placed a hand on his shoulder and looked him straight in the eyes. "You were never a burden," he said firmly. "You were my savior when I needed one. Now let me do the same for you." Tears pricked the man's eyes. He had spent so long thinking he was alone in the world, but tonight everything had changed. He nodded slowly, unable to find the right words, but the groom understood. They walked out together, side by side. The night air was cool, but for the first time in years, the man didn't feel the cold. He felt warmth, not from the weather, but from the love surrounding him. As they drove away, the man looked out the window, watching the city lights pass by. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. Because he wasn't alone anymore. He had a place to go, people who cared, and a second chance at life. And as he sat there, watching the lights blur into the distance, he smiled, a real, genuine smile. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever.